Richard Wolff, old friend, always good to see you, sir.
My pleasure, Mitch. It's been a long association, and it's been a really good ride every step of the way.
I've enjoyed every moment, and I've learned a tremendous amount about economics and political economy, and you name it. And so I very much wanted to have this conversation with you today, especially as just on Tuesday, the House of Representatives approved a budget resolution, could potentially represent, which some are saying, the most significant investment in the country, perhaps since Lyndon Johnson's push for the Great Society and the creation of Medicare. This budget resolution would do such things as expand Medicare, make community college free for 2 years, put hundreds of millions of dollars towards elderly and disabled care, create a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. It does a whole lot more. It's $3.5 trillion in total. Yesterday's vote, however, was not the final passage. Just to be clear, it's just the beginning of the process, and it was hard to get all the Democrats on board to support that. We'll save the politics for a little bit later. But what they did is they passed what's called a budget resolution. It's the same budget resolution that was passed in the Senate that was written by the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, Bernie Sanders. And so now with the budget resolution, what they have to do is they have to go fill it in. It just sort of provides the broad outline. So anything we say or anything that I just even said is in this measure could change because the details are not there yet. But using this process of a budget resolution would allow Democrats to be able to avoid a potential and probable Republican filibuster. Now, the real challenge, though, is how they get all Democrats on board to be able to do that. We've already had two senators, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. Both Democrats indicate that they're not likely to support this measure. So it's still a big political fight to come. It's being connected to this $1 trillion, even though only about half of it's in new spending, infrastructure measure. That's just my quick summary as we dive into this. What are your thoughts about what's happening on Capitol Hill right now, especially with this budget resolution?
Well, I'm thrilled and happy that Bernie has been able to get such a bill even to this point. These things are things that people in this country, myself included, have advocated for a very long time. So I'm happy to see it. I'm grateful to see it. But I want to stress what you're not going to see very much of, which is the very inadequately developed commitments here. In other words, we are in the presence of something that is too little and way too late. I'm going to give you a few examples just to drive the point home. I'm familiar particularly with France, but what I'm about to say about France is true for most other European countries. They have been giving subsidies, help to families that have either more than one child or have any children for many, many decades. It was automatic. In France, which I know well, it is a significant amount of money that has been provided to every family in France with children, at least for the last 50 years. Not 50 months, not 50 years. We have not done it. Every European country has had maternal and in some cases also paternal leave, either when you have a child for a birth in your family, or if you've had to take care of an elderly, you have been given by law large numbers of weeks, sometimes exceeding a year, in order to handle, to cope, to take care of a new baby or an elderly person. We're not even talking about doing that. We're talking about doing a minor, small step in what has been the law and the regular. Okay, community college. Wow. Let me give you the list. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, Poland. I'm trying to think of the other. All of those countries, all colleges, all undergraduate, all graduate education is tuition free and has been for years. In Germany, this free education is available not just to German citizens, but to anyone listening to this program, watching this video. You can get tuition-free, fee-free education in Germany. And a footnote, Germany's higher education system is the envy of the world. You are not sacrificing anything. If anything, you're taking a step up in terms of the quality of the education you're going to get. So, I mean, I could go on. Here's my point. We have neglected the public sphere for so long. We have held back benefits for our people so long that much of the damage has already happened and been woven into our lives as families and as a culture. But these things that are being proposed, and as you rightly caution, haven't been passed yet, just been proposed. And given the opposition, we kind of all know that what's going to happen is that not more generosity is going to happen as it goes through, but it's going to be pared down. So, wow, I'm saying to myself, whoa. And this is a general problem. It's not just with this particular bill that just took that one step, as you've informed us. Let me give you two other examples of what's going on that will get the same idea across. Last week, lots of hype about an additional amount of money the Biden administration has allocated for the SNAP program, what we used to call food stamps. And a lot of 5.6, I believe was the number, 5.6 billion additional dollars were spent. And that's a large number, and we're all excited, or we're supposed to be. But, you know, I'm an economist, and so I do my little arithmetic the way they taught me in school. So let me translate for you what that means. Here we go. The amount of money worth of food stamps you can get is going to go up from $121 per month if you qualify to $157 per month per person if you qualify. Now be careful, if you make more than $2,600 a month in a family of four, you don't qualify. So the majority of Americans, you're out the window. Let's just focus on those who get food stamps because they qualify. All right, it's 42 million Americans. Roughly half of them are kids, children, below 17, et cetera, et cetera. Now, let's see. If you go from $121 a month to $157, that's an additional $36 per month. If you assume on average that our months have 30, 31 days, we're talking a little over $1 a day. That's the increase. So 121, that's a little over $4 a day. You're now going to get an extra dollar, and you're going to get $5 a day instead of the $4 you got before. Nobody in their right mind thinks this is an adequate response to the reality that one of the richest countries in the world has 42 million people, that's 1 out of 8 of us, hungry. Food insecurity is a euphemism. It used to be called hungry, not getting enough food. And let me stress, it's not enough food. Nothing is said here about the quality of the food. For large numbers of Americans, it's soda pop and chips as the basic core of the meal, which, I mean, is as damaging for your physical well-being as not having enough, or at least it's a contest between them. So we have a lot of hoopla about giving people who are the poorest amongst us, to whom we gave an extra $4, ready? $4 a month to help them in their hunger. We're jacking it up to a bit more than $5. And this is what we think, and I won't even get to what it means if you're a Republican or a conservative Democrat, and you think that is too much to be given, it boggles the mind. Now, another calculation. If you multiply 42 million Americans who are eligible, and they're now all going to get the extra buck a month, add it up. If it's an extra dollar and there's 42 million, that's $42 million per day that's going to have to pay for extra food for people. And that works out for 365 days to a little over $15 billion. 15. So let's do a number. That is 1/2 of 1% of what was spent on the war in Afghanistan. The entirety of what we're doing for 1 out of 8 of our fellow Americans, half of whom are children, we're spending 1/2 of 1% of this magnificent 20 years of bombing to death every half acre in that poor country. A war, by the way, in which the richest country in the world, with by far the most developed military, was defeated by one of the poorest countries on this planet. You have to be very careful to avoid seeing anything, not to learn what these signals are telling you. Last one. The earned income credit. An awful lot of liberal Democrats seem to be very excited about this one. Well, extra money has been given. And again, giving money to poor people, because you have to be in the lower half of the population, or lower 2/3, to be even eligible for any of it. So yes, it helps those families. It's a credit. It reduces the amount of tax you owe Uncle Sam if you qualify for this. And then when you look at it all, here's what it comes to. Payments for the rest of this year, roughly $1,500 per child if you qualify. Works out to $250 a day for the 6 months of the second half of this year. That's what we're really talking about in this exciting new program. Okay, but let's do it again. If you get $250 extra a month per kid, that works out to an extra $8 a day. Do the arithmetic. It's what I do for a living. It's $8 a day. No one, you couldn't possibly believe that you're helping people emerge from poverty or making a significant difference in the life they lead by giving them an extra $8 a day. I mean, what are you talking about? Is it good to do? Yes. Will it help them? For sure. But you're not dealing with your poverty. You're not dealing with all of the social forces that make Americans extremely rich in a minority and extremely not rich in a majority. You haven't changed the distribution of income. You haven't done anything about average wages. You haven't stopped this situation where corporate executives get 300 times what the average worker is required to live on. You haven't changed the spectacle of the richest people competing for how many minutes they can sit in a rocket ship going out to space, while the rest of us know that we can't pay our kids' college education. I mean, these, for me, taking a step back and being an economist, I am seeing an enormous struggle over what is, and I hope I've shown that to you, way too little and way too late.
I will give you, this is not the New Deal, nor is it creating Medicare for all. A part of this $3.5 trillion, I'll just add, to pay for it, and I don't disagree with you in that it's likely to be much smaller if they ever get it out of Congress. Still a big question mark. It feels like a pipe dream. I guess what makes this a little bit different, though, is it seems like it has the full backing of both the president and the Democratic leader in the Senate and in the House, who have said, even though they kind of negotiated this down a little bit yesterday to get the 9 moderate Democrats to vote for it, who have said that they wouldn't move on the infrastructure measure that has broad support until the Senate passed this budget resolution, which right now is $3.5 trillion, but certainly not the New Deal. There's no doubt about that. It would extend the tax credit for children that low-income families are getting right now. It also would far more aggressively than anything else that has been gotten through Congress start to address our energy system and try to move it towards more renewables energy. And I guess, I think of, and I don't disagree with anything that you said there, but I think of a new report that came out maybe a month ago or so. It was reported largely in the New York Times. I didn't see it many other places, but there was a report that came out by the Urban Institute. And I guess the Urban Institute is this think tank that does a lot of economic modeling. Congress oftentimes will rely on the reports when they're working on legislation. And it came out with a report saying in the last year that poverty had shrunk by 45%. Now, the poverty level is really low, so it's maybe not necessarily that difficult to get above the poverty line. But they said because of the enhanced unemployment benefits, the child tax credit, the eviction moratorium, the stimulus checks, and other things that came as part of the pandemic relief programs, that poverty had shrunk in this country by 45%, which to me, and you may take on all those numbers, I'm happy to hear it, but to me really points to and suggests the role that the government can play in relieving poverty.
Yes, let me talk about it, but let me pick up on just the point that you ended up with. I want people to think about the fact that at a time, roughly early 2020 into now, in the last 18 months, more or less, we had a little bit more than half of our labor force were out of work, some for the whole period, some for only a few weeks, and everything in between. So it's reasonable to say that over the last 18 months, we're an extraordinarily exceptional period in American history. Everybody would agree to that. And one of the most exceptional things was the vast number of jobs that couldn't function anymore. Either the restaurant was closed, or the department store was closed, or the sports arena was closed. We all know huge amounts of dislocation. And in that dislocation, people were prepared to, do without income. It was unthinkable. And so we stepped in, and as you rightly say, the government is suddenly in there giving you extra money for unemployment, giving you extra this, extra that, credits, spending money, picking up the cost of this, that, pumping the economy up with record amounts of new money, deficit spending, everything. The government stepped in and reduced poverty by its exceptional intervention. You know what that says in another way? That the normal functioning of our normally private enterprise capitalist system produces the normal poverty that only an exceptional government intervention can temporarily relieve. And that's what happened in the 1930s. You mentioned the New Deal before. The New Deal was a bevy of programs, more, bigger, and better than these, including all those being discussed in Congress. And if you look at the statistics, inequality in the United States dropped sharply during the 1930s. Those programs gave to the average person something real and didn't do comparably for those who didn't need it at the top. We have a different situation. Yes, we're helping those at the bottom. We're reducing poverty, but we're not reducing the wealth at the top. It's not a shift. It means those at the top continue to become more wealthy, but those at the bottom also are given a temporary, and everything is discussed really in terms of temporary. A lot of these programs you listed and many more have points when they're supposed to stop. They could be renewed. My guess is there will be an effort to renew them. Some of those efforts may succeed, but we're basically thinking, all of our politicians, of going back to normal. Indeed, that's a slogan. Mr. Biden, back, build better back. We're going back. Going back is going to what we had, which got us to where we are. The exception isn't the solution. The exception is precisely that, an exception brought on by the most extreme intervention in American history. Let's remember the 1930s was a terrible depression, but it didn't occur together with a public health disaster. And we've had the Spanish flu at the beginning of the 20th century, but it didn't happen together with an economic collapse. We're living through the combination of these two, which is an extraordinarily negative time. And even then, producing this, as you rightly say, not even what the New Deal did, it's denialism. It's a denial that we are going through a period in which things are happening all around us, and we see it, sort of, but we're busy denying it. If I may just depart for a moment, look at COVID. The United States is 4% of the world's population, and we have 20% of the world's deaths from COVID. We're a rich country. We have a highly developed medical care system. What in the world is going on to put us in that position? We've just spent $2 trillion, the richest country in the world, with what everybody recognizes as the overwhelmingly most developed military in the world. And we went to war against one of the poorest countries on this planet, Afghanistan, and we were defeated. And that's what happened. And all the rest is window dressing on this difficult to face reality. But you put that COVID number together with this Afghanistan disaster, and you begin to have to wonder. And if Americans want to deny it, who can stop them? But I can tell you, as somebody who spends a great deal of my time reading European and other newspapers, none of this is lost on the rest of the world. The United States looks to the rest of the world to be a society that is in decline. And I cannot stress that enough. It's not a question of having you all agree with me on this. You don't have to. We can disagree. But you cannot pretend that there aren't signs pointing in that direction. Lots of them, and that people around the world are talking about this. Europeans are reevaluating who they're aligned with. Before we went on the air, I was talking, if you recall, Mitch, about a conversation I had with the press in New Zealand very recently. And they're all upset that they're not doing more to stop the Delta variant of COVID. And there's a big debate going on all through New Zealand society. So I'm sitting there, I'm listening to that, and then I do a little bit of research. They're all arguing about how they could do more. They're very upset. Well, here's the numbers I found. Population of New Zealand, roughly 5 million people. The number of people who have so far died since the pandemic began in New Zealand, 26 individuals. We're talking in this country about over 600,000 dead people, fellow Americans. They're upset that they lost 26. What is going on here? We complain in this country of global supply lines, that our prices are going up because the goods are scarce. And this is one of the reasons why goods are scarce? Because in every other country that matters in the world, when they have some COVID, they lock down. They lock down the city, but more importantly, they lock down the factory and they lock down the ports. so the stuff can't get out because they're going to take care of this disease. That's why the People's Republic of China has, a trivial number of COVID dead, nothing like what we have, even though they have 4 times the population of the United States. But we're complaining with supply. That's because of the way they handle COVID. We didn't have lockdowns here, and no one seems to have told the United States it's not about whether you in America have lockdowns. It's about whether there will be lockdowns in the world, because you're part of the world, the United States. You're more dependent on what comes from outside than you have ever been. So if we lock down, your economy will feel it, which is what we're going through now. All of these things add up to economic problems accumulating. Even this infrastructure, and I don't mean to chew your ear off, Mitch, so stop me if I keep going too much.
This is what we brought you on for, sir.
Okay, the infrastructure, right? It sounds like a lot, $1 trillion or $2 trillion, whatever it is. But it isn't. We've neglected our infrastructure for 50 years. So what you really have to think of is what should we have done in the first of those 50, in the 10th of those 50, in the 20th of those 50. We didn't do that. And by the way, we didn't do that because of the peculiarity of American capitalism. And that peculiarity is worth a moment. Our politicians are successful, they think, if they do 2 things: provide services to the public that votes for them, and not tax the public that votes for them, both individuals and businesses. Okay, this is impossible. Either you're going to provide the services, or you're going to raise the taxes, save on the taxes. You can't do both because you have to pay for the services that everybody expects you to deliver. How do you handle that? Well, we both know how you handle that. In this country, you do 2 things. You don't raise the taxes. Instead, you borrow the money. You go into debt as a local government, as a state government, as a federal government. You borrow. And of course, this is terribly unjust, because who do you borrow from? The only people that are in a position to lend to the government are rich people and businesses. They are the major lenders to the governments. So basically what you're doing is you're saying to them, we won't tax you. Instead, we'll borrow the money from you, which lets you get it all back in a few years. And meanwhile, we'll pay you interest. What wealthy taxpayer wouldn't go for this deal? This is a no-brainer. For the average person, though, it means more and more taxes coming down the road to do all of this for the people who need it least in society, the wealthy. But there is a second thing every politician can do. And the more unscrupulous they are, the more they do it. This way, they don't have to cut services. They don't have to raise taxes, and they can pretend they're not borrowing. Well, this is flim-flam, because you can't have all of that. So how do they manage it? Answer: no maintenance for the infrastructure. Let the roads go. Let the school buildings go. Let the sewer go. Let it all go. That way, the money that any moron would understand has to be spent on upkeep isn't. And then you say, see, now vote for me because I didn't cut your other services, I didn't raise your taxes, and I didn't borrow money. I just let it go. And then after 50 years, here's what you discover. You are shooting yourself in the foot. You know, a bad bridge slows traffic down. When traffic is slowed down, you have to spend more money on fuel, more money on the truck driver's salary. It's costing you. And that cost shows up in the price of everything that's produced when there's a crappy road or a broken bridge or an inadequate communication system or a flooded highway because you didn't maintain the sewer pipes the way they should have been. The schools are crumbling. We know the story. And you know what? In other countries, they don't do this. This is not a universal problem. And so they don't have those costs. So they outcompete American companies. And American companies go to China. You know one of the reasons why, if you talk to the engineers? Because all their pipes are new. All their infrastructure is fresh and maintained. And so it's more profitable to build. the stupidity of having a political system work the way I describe, damaging its own foundation, that's what we're doing as a nation. And that usually goes with what is called by historians historical decline. It's the sign of a declining empire, a declining powerhouse. It can't do all it wants to do. It extends itself so far, and then it keels over because it has overreached itself. We have to have that conversation because we are doing now the kind of self-destruction that if you were an individual, those around you who love you would want you to get some help, talk to someone, find a way, because if you're not going to do that, you're in a denial that is self-destructive.
Richard Wolff is our guest. Richard Wolff is a professor emeritus of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He teaches at the New School in New York City. He's the host of the very popular program, Economic Update. His latest book is called The Sickness is the System. Let's talk about decline.
Good.
We've seen decline before. We saw European countries in decline in the first half of the 20th century. And yet they came out of it with some pretty impressive, comparatively speaking, social net programs, safety net programs.
Right.
So could that not be a possibility here as well?
Yes, it could. And I'm glad you brought it up because it means we now have to spend a few minutes talking about how and why they were able to do it in order to be able to figure out how we might be able to learn from it. But let's start by making a little bit of a distinction. The main four continental economies in Europe, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, those are the four big economies of Europe, mainland Europe. They all have what you just said. They have a social safety net way better than anything the United States has had, and that's been true for decades. My family is partly French, and when I go to France, which I do as often as I can manage it, I speak with them and I meet with them, and just to give you an idea, they have had cradle-to-grave health insurance from the minute you're born to the day you die for their entire lifetimes. That's how old it is, and some of them are as old as I am. So they just simply take that for granted. They've had free or very cheap higher education in superb French universities for as long as anyone can remember, and on and on and on and on. Subsidy to children. In France, it's called Famine Norm. That means families with a high number of people in them, roughly. You get an automatic kind of subsidy. The government provides you with a social worker for several months after every baby is born. The person that comes to your home helps you bathe the baby, does the laundry, just provide. And that's considered to be what it should be. You get months off as maternal care. Fathers can claim time off as well. Half of all the politicians in France have to be women. That's the law now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They have been doing things and this is not to suggest that France doesn't have problems. It does, of course it does, serious ones. But in terms of this sort of basic financial support, wow, are they ahead of us?
Where did that come from then? I mean, if they're in a country that was in decline, first half of the 20th century. Those are my words. You could disagree if you like, but
no. You're absolutely right. They had an empire. They lost it.
So how do you go
from the British, like the Germans, like the Spaniards, and like the Italians? They all lost their empires.
So how do you go from that to having what we recognize as these, again, comparative to us, these pretty impressive safety net programs in society?
Well, the answer is they produced and they sustained what the United States produced in the 1930s, but did not sustain. And here's what I mean. I'm going to use France as an example, but it applies to the others. In France, in the period of the 1930s, Great Depression, they produced a powerful alliance. It had roots earlier, but they produced a powerful alliance of labor unions and socialist and communist political parties. They worked together to get through the Depression, and the solidarity that they achieved then, they did never lose. For those of you who might like to know, if you've ever gone to Paris and you've looked at the magnificent subway system that that country has, beautiful, clean, elegant subway. Well, the person driving that subway train through the tunnels, that person is a member of a labor union. It has been organized for many, many decades. And that labor union is extremely close to the French Communist Party. I don't want to scare you, but you were sitting in a communist subway, ta-da, ta-da, appropriate music. And that coalition of the Socialist Party with its unions, allies, and the Communist Party, the other big left party for most of the last half century with its unions, that was a bloc the government could not ignore. You never had the kind of McCarthyite witch hunts in France that you had here. Nothing like that. The socialist and communist parties that were strong in this country in the 1930s were obliterated after the war with a systematic arresting them and hounding them and deporting them and all the things that those of you who know that history are aware. You couldn't do that in France. You couldn't even do it in Spain, which was still struggling under a fascist dictator. You couldn't do it in Italy, which was recoiling from the Mussolini dictatorship in the war. So you had a powerful socialist labor union coalition, and they guaranteed that all of these social programs were passed and they were sustained. Even when conservatives tried to roll them back, they sometimes achieved some rollback, but basically they couldn't eviscerate the programs. In this country, by destroying the socialists and communists, but more important, destroying the coalition between socialist and communist-oriented people on the one hand and the labor union movement on the other, you took away the foundation of what supported the New Deal. So the period after the New Deal undid the New Deal. And they tried that in those other European countries, but the opposition was too strong and they couldn't get it done. That's why I have to say to people when they say, we live in the best country in the world. I mean, I understand patriotism. I understand. I want to say it too. I was born in Ohio. I've lived all my life here in this country. But the truth of the matter is that the Europeans have a level of basic support. Bread is subsidized. You get a baguette, the classic French bread. It's way cheaper than American bread and much better, but it is subsidized because of the tradition, which goes back to the French Revolution, that bread is a basic thing for all people, and therefore the government must make it affordable. They have affordable housing. I urge people to visit Vienna. In Vienna, the socialists, when they were in power in the government there, created a program of public housing so that to this day, half of the apartments in Vienna are public.
Vienna's amazing. Vienna's amazing. I did get a chance to visit it before the pandemic.
Everybody listening, go. Take a look at half of the apartments that are public housing. Everything you've ever thought about what a housing project looks like, feels like, all that will go out the window. You'll see what a society can do that wants to make sure that everybody can afford a house. There's no homeless there. I picked Vienna because it's not a socialist country. Non-socialist governments have tried to push back. Never wins because half the Vienna population tells them, you touch these houses, you're toast on the next election.
It's like Medicare here.
Yes, it's a little bit like that, or Social Security. That's a third rail. You don't go near there because that's going to hurt you politically if you even say boo about it. So for me, all I can tell you is, and this is painful for Americans often to hear, you want a different government that wouldn't be making mountains out of molehills. telling you about the fantastic program for hungry people that works out to be going from $4 a day to $5 a day on your allotment if you're poor. And you realize the hype and its distance from the reality. If you don't want that, you've got to help build the political movement inside the United States that can provide the support for what it is you want, because that's what they did in Europe.
So the opposition to the three, and I don't want to, I'm going to come back to this budget resolution bill because there's one last thing I want to say before we wrap up our conversation. But the opposition to this measure is we can't afford it. It's too expensive. How does Austria or these other European countries economically pull it off?
Well, the easiest, and I don't mean to be flip, but the easiest answer is count the number of Austrian troops in Afghanistan. You can do that on the fingers of one hand, and you'll have fingers left over. I mean, we teach this in the first semester of every economics course. It's called the choice between guns and butter. That's how it appears in the textbook. If you don't want to, if you want to be able to afford, because that's the argument you just gave, if you want to be able to afford to feed your people, maybe you shouldn't be the policeman of the world with 750 military bases conducting wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, who knows where else with our covert operation. Come on. Most Americans understand this perfectly clearly. This has nothing to do with what you can afford. This has to do, we can afford it. It's your priorities.
Let me ask you this.
Saying, I feel bitter that I can't afford, I don't know, a Mercedes-Benz car. Well, it's not that you can't afford it. It's that you have other priorities. You want to send your kid to college. You want to be able to feed your family. So you're not going to park your Mercedes in the garage.
But let me ask you this. Can those countries have more of a modest size military because the United States is the policeman or woman of the world?
Absolutely, they could. But here's the problem. They have oppositions. It's not going to be easy. You're looking at a pattern that developed over 75 years, basically since the end of the Second World War. At the end of that war, all the potential competitors of the United States were economically and militarily exhausted. The war was not fought in the United States. With the exception of Pearl Harbor, there were no military events here. By contrast, the military events in Italy, in Germany, in Russia, in Japan, all the other countries with which we might have competed were wrecks. And so we emerge as on the king of the hill. The war isn't fought here. Everybody is desperate to overcome this problem and all the rest of it. And then we become the country that is the military and dominant and playing that role. But let's be real clear, because Americans have a little one-sided idea about this. If you're in Europe, they'll explain to you, you were the military power. You used it. You used it to give you the advantage over all of us. British companies, French companies, German companies, they always had to stand in line because with the American military dominance, the first contracts, the best contracts, the ear of the prime minister of fill-in-the-blank country went to your country's businesses. You got a lot of benefits. So don't come whining to us, yeah, you maintained the biggest military. Yeah, that was because as quoting your president Eisenhower, your military-industrial complex was making a lot of money. Look, let's be clear. The war in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, which has been lost, was lost to the Americans who gave up their lives. It was lost to the Afghani people, many more of them, who gave up their lives. All those Americans who came home with physical and mental problems. I won't bore you with the statistic. We lost more Americans who in the military who committed suicide after coming home compared to those who actually lost their lives in combat. All of these things that were happening, but there was one group of Americans that were very happy with 20 years of war. The people who produced the guns and the missiles and the tanks and the you name it, they were having contracts. They look at the prices, the stock prices of Raytheon and the other corporations that were involved.
It's pretty wild.
What?
It's pretty wild. Yeah.
Spectacular. They didn't lose this war. They won. But all the other participants, they lost. Even the Taliban, as the technical winner, lost huge numbers of their militants, of their people, of their families, of their villages. I mean, the losses are easy, but the winner, the only winner, not the strategic needs of the United States, not geopolitical, but that military-industrial complex. So, yeah, there are beneficiaries, too, of the American carrying. And if the Americans do withdraw, that's what they're discussing in Europe now, because they're reevaluating they're not clear that they ought to be allied with the United States anymore. The United States is not economically growing. The United States is divided internally in ways that frighten them. Donald Trump was a specter. Are there more of him coming down the pike? And now the disaster with COVID, and now the disaster with Afghanistan. They're beginning to have debates in the German parliament about whether Germany ought to ally more with China than with the United States. And they're making these conversations because they feel they are practically issues they have to deal with. The world is changing, and it's changing in a way that the United States is in a decline. That's how they see it. They don't know exactly what that means or where that leads. China is growing, but they don't know how long that's going to last. So everything is in a very limbo-y kind of position, and Americans have got to understand that, or else the world is going to slip right by them, and they're going to wonder. And let me give you an example of how sad that can be. The British Empire. It once ruled the world. Britannia rules the waves, and as the critics used to say, waves the rules. They ran the world. It was the British Empire. All of that's gone. And in the end, in 2016, the British people were so depressed and distraught by the end of the empire and all that that meant, that had gone on uninterrupted for a century, voted to blame Europe for this, and they will have nothing to do with Europe, which was a monstrous historical example of shooting yourself in the foot. That solves nothing. You're in worse shape now than you were before, which all parts of British politics now admit. Why did a perfectly smart people shoot themselves in the foot? Because when you're distraught, you can often pick the wrong target to fix your problem because you're so upset. That's a lesson. I hope we learn it. Otherwise, we will be having more global adventures with the outcome that Afghanistan has shown us.
But after the fall of the British Empire, Great Britain did get universal health care. And that's going to lead me into my final question here, and we're almost out of time. And I'm going to come back to this $3.5 trillion budget resolution. What I've heard you say, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but what I hear you saying is it's too little too late.
Yes.
The way I see it, and I'm not an economist, but the way I see it, when you were talking about France and the investments that they put into their people, including for care of children, care of the elderly, this is a measure that puts hundreds of millions of dollars in the towards care for the elderly, for the disabled. This is something we've all had to deal with aging great-grandparents, grandparents, parents. Ourselves will need this at some point. It's difficult when you have to care for someone who is aging or who just needs a significant amount of care. We could definitely use help in that. This would start that. And I guess for me, if we compare it to a lot of other things, it would fall short. But if we were to put it in the time of the type of politics that we've been living through the last 3 or 4 decades, to me, this $3.5 trillion budget resolution measure, if it were to get through the way they're talking about it now, is a significant shift if we just put it in its own political realm within the United States and how our politics work here. And it seems to me this is a significant moment because, no, this isn't the New Deal, but this could be opening up an avenue towards seeing government being involved in assisting regular people get by in life?
Yes and no. I agree in part. I disagree. And maybe we could end on that. For me, I agree that it could be. It could be the beginning of something different. And I understand that the hope of the Democratic Party establishment is that enough people will see enough of a benefit, even in the next year or two, that they will want to keep it going and that they will provide the political votes to enable it to keep going. Because if they don't, if the Republicans get in or the more conservative Democrats, it'll be undone the same way the New Deal was undone, only this time faster. But here's where I disagree. That's not going to happen by itself. That's not going to happen if you just give an extra buck to a poor person for his or her food per day for the next 2 years. Will they be grateful? Yes. Will it make them enthusiastic supporters for what you're doing? No. That's a political project. You have to supplement the relatively meager help that's being given with the explanation you just gave, Mitch, that this is step one, that if we band together, if we're a politically solid bloc, if we have allies in the labor movement, in the political movement, in the women's movement, in the anti-racism movement, if we can put together a powerful political constituency, yeah, then it can become the first step. But if you don't do that, if you just count on your hyped story on a very slender base, I don't think you're going to pull it off, which means, and this is my message, I guess, to Mr. Biden and to Nancy Pelosi and all the others, your best hope, which I know frustrates you, is to get with and behind the progressives in the Democratic Party, because they are the closest you have to a link to the constituency that might build the movement you need. Otherwise, your reforms, which you prefer over more extreme measures, will themselves not endure. Because that's what happened. In the Great Depression, after all, there was this fight. The reformers versus the revolutionaries. The revolutionaries were defeated. We got a lot of reforms. Yeah, we did. But we didn't build a constituency. And even when we did, we couldn't hold it together after the war. They took away the constituency and the reforms were undone. The minimum wage passed then is now a caricature of itself. Public jobs program, which was the hallmark of the second half of the Great Depression, we don't even talk about it in this country. Not even a discussion of a vast new public jobs program. That's a terrible failure, even to learn from American history. So you better have the political mobilization of the left, because that's really what I'm talking about, not out of some ideological commitment, but if you want those reforms to build in the way you just talked about, Mitch, you better do that, because there's no other way it's going to happen.
Richard Wolff is a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He also teaches at the New School in New York City. He's the host of the program Economic Update. You can find his work online at Democracy at Work. And he is also the author of the book, The Sickness is the System. Professor Wolff, always a great pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. Important conversation, and thank you for making it happen.